Welcome to the Academic Center for Writing's presentation on feminist literary criticism. Feminist criticism derives from a critique of a history of oppression. It examines the ways in which literature either reinforces or subverts the economic, political, social, and psychological oppression of women, and it questions the acceptance of men's writing and perspectives as the norm. Works from white male authors describing their experiences have long been the standard for literature. Their viewpoints have been considered universal, regardless of the fact that they do not represent all readers. Because this so-called universality has been a major deciding factor for literary greatness, this has excluded women, writers of color, and other marginalized individuals. These writers' works have not been considered universal, and therefore could not become part of the literary canon. While some of these authors may have been extremely popular, such popularity was not a criterion for greatness. Initially, feminist criticism condemned the misrepresentation of women in literature and stressed the importance of women's writings of their own experiences. In the 1970s, when the feminist movement was in what is known as its second wave, feminist criticism looked at literature as a reflection of a patriarchal, sexist society with degrading portrayals of women. These portrayals were thought of as symptoms of a system that needed to be overturned. Traditional gender roles have portrayed men as rational, strong, protective, and decisive, while portraying women as emotional, irrational, weak, and submissive. These gender roles have been used to justify inequalities, such as offering women less pay for equal work, the belief in the inborn superiority of men and inferiority of women is known as biological essentialism. The danger in these generalizations is that if women's differences are based on biology, there is no solution to their oppression. It is not that feminists deny that biological differences between men and women exist, but they argue that these differences do not make men inherently superior. It is important to note that feminism distinguishes between sex and gender. Sex refers to an individual's biological categorization as male or female. Gender refers to an individual's cultural categorization as masculine or feminine. Accordingly, women are not born feminine, and men are not born masculine. Girls do not instinctually prefer pink, nor do boys instinctually prefer blue. Instead, individuals are guided to adopt the characteristics and preferences of these social constructs. Feminist criticism soared after second-wave feminism was born. Occurring during the 19th and early 20th centuries, first-wave feminism focused on legal rights, such as the right to vote. Second-wave feminism was at its height during the 1960s and 70s and focused on all areas of women's experiences, including family, sexuality, and work. There are numerous works that have contributed to the field of feminism and feminist criticism. Three of the most influential are A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft, A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, and The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. Written in 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft's polemic on female oppression is considered to be one of the earliest works on feminist theory. In it, she argues that women are not born weak, but made weak, and that preventing women from receiving an education keeps them in their oppressed state. She ponders the radical notion that women are human beings first and women second. As such, they should be given the opportunity to develop their abilities just as men have. She calls for women to be treated as rational adults instead of being viewed as helpless children. She finds the construct of femininity, the weak elegance of mind, exquisite sensibility, and sweet docility of manners, to be condescending, and aims to show that it is far more worthy to be praised as a human being first, regardless of one's sex or gender. She condemns the belief that women are to look for happiness only in love, and that the purpose of their lives is to please others. Speaking specifically on literature, Wollstonecraft insists women only read trivial novels because their education has left them untrained to consider heavier topics. She further criticizes the types of novels written for women, writing that they are addressed only to the imagination and provide nothing to think about. This last idea is one that has persisted throughout feminist criticism. In reading works intended for or about women, we are examining what these works tell women about their lives. Virginia Woolf's influential treatise on women and writing was penned in 1929. In this collection of essays, Woolf ponders the meaning of women in fiction. Does it mean women and what they are like? Does it mean women and the fiction they write? Does it mean women and the fiction that is written about them? And she questions why women are not represented better in literature. Her answer to the dearth of women writers is money. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. What Woolf is saying here is that women are not able to write their own stories, for they do not have the financial freedom to do so. This is one of the main reasons why women's experiences are underrepresented in literature. Women do not benefit from having learnt the great art of making money, and do not have the opportunity to leave their money like their fathers and their grandfathers before them to found fellowships and lectureships and prizes and scholarships appropriated to the use of their own sex. She additionally posits that motherhood has a detrimental effect on women's opportunity for making money, and therefore, making a fortune and bearing 13 children, no human being could stand it. First there are 9 months before the baby is born. Then the baby is born. Then there are 3 or 4 months spent in feeding the baby. After the baby is fed, there are certainly 5 years spent in play with the baby. You cannot, it seems, let children run about the streets. Although women have found more effective ways to integrate motherhood into their professional lives, Woolf's questions remain valid concerns for feminists today. French existentialist Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex in 1949. This philosophical work on gender asks the questions, what is a woman? How are women different from humans? From where does femininity emanate? The problem, as she describes it, is that women are defined as women first and humans second. From the book of Genesis, woman has been defined as other. Humanity is male, and man defines woman, not in herself, but in relation to himself. She is not considered an autonomous being. She is nothing other than what man decides. She is thus called the sex, meaning that the male sees her essentially as a sexed being. For him she is sex, so she is it in the absolute. She is determined and differentiated in relation to man, while he is not in relation to her. She is the inessential in front of the essential. He is the subject, he is the absolute, she is the other. De Beauvoir further writes, man grasps his body as a direct and normal link with the world that he believes he apprehends in all objectivity, whereas he considers woman's body an obstacle, a prison, burdened by everything that particularizes it. In this statement, we can see de Beauvoir's criticism of the belief that men's experiences and viewpoints are universal. Whereas a man speaks as a human, a woman can never separate herself from the fact that she is thinking, speaking, and acting as a woman. De Beauvoir goes on to illuminate several major problems plaguing women, such as having no shared past, history, or religion, as women are tied to men through their home, work, economic interests, and social conditions. There exists no separate community of women, as there might be separate communities of races or social classes, so it has been historically difficult for women as a group to realize their otherness. As such, women are more inclined to align their interests with the men of their demographic than with other women. She writes, the tie that binds her to her oppressors is unlike any other. In terms of literary criticism, de Beauvoir encourages the reader to examine this otherness of women and question the way they are made dependent on men. Feminist criticism poses a number of questions. These include, how are the female characters portrayed? Is a woman portrayed as virginal or promiscuous? Is she a wife or a concubine? Does she embody more than one trait, or is she restricted to a narrow description? Do women accept or reject these roles? Are the women shown as happy to be wives, mothers, or girlfriends, or do they struggle to be independent? Are they resigned to the roles put upon them by men, or do they resist categorization? How is the work influenced by the author's gender? What are the differences between female characters written by men compared to those written by women? How are the relationships between men and women portrayed? Are they contentious? Do they show a partnership? How is the work gendered? Is it a work considered to be for women? What leads you to this conclusion? This question is particularly important when we consider books written for children and young adults, as indoctrination to gender roles starts at birth. How does the work define femininity or masculinity? Are they mutually exclusive? Do they share common traits? Is femininity equated with weakness and masculinity equated with strength? Does the work affirm or question traditional views of women? Does it uphold the idea of women as emotional, irrational, weak beings, or does it challenge this? What marital and/or sexual expectations are placed on the female characters? Are the characters expected to be chaste until marriage? Are they punished for not having been so? What behavioral expectations are placed on the female characters? Are women expected to be meek and quiet? Are there ramifications for their speaking out and refusing to be silent? How would the story be different if the character were male instead of female? Would the story still work, or would it seem ridiculous? Why? Finally, what do these portrayals reveal about the operation of the patriarchy? This is what we are ultimately examining here. How do these portrayals of women show the ways in which society upholds men's power while excluding women? Any type of literature, regardless of whether it was written by a woman or with feminist aims, can be analyzed from a feminist perspective. For example, many fairy tales are ripe for feminist criticism, as they reveal the ways in which patriarchal ideology informs even supposedly innocent children's literature. Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, and Cinderella all feature the common trope of the beautiful, young, helpless female saved from a terrible fate by a charming young man who carries her off to be married and live happily ever after. Let's apply some of the above questions to these well-known stories. How does the work define femininity or masculinity? In all of these stories, the main female character is renowned for her beauty, and this is her strongest trait. She is easily tricked and exhibits little ability to care for herself. She is contrasted with an evil, older female character whose jealousy over the main character's beauty puts the main character in peril. Whether innocent or evil, the concerns of all the women involved are trivial. The men are all royalty and are saviors who can easily provide financial and physical protection to the lead female character. What marital and/or sexual expectations are placed on the female characters? All three characters are chaste. In Sleeping Beauty and Snow White, the lead characters are literally awakened by a kiss from their princes. This suggests that a woman's sexuality does not exist until the appropriate man arrives to claim her and rouse it. The plots of these stories reinforce the idea that marriage to the right type of man, wealthy, royal, and respected, is the reward for the well-behaved woman. If she is not well-behaved, then she becomes an evil being. This harmful dichotomy suggests that women are either virtuous, gentle, submissive, virginal maidens, that is to say, good girls, or they are petty, jealous, violent monsters, bad girls. Marriage is the ultimate reward in all three stories. What do these portrayals reveal about the operation of the patriarchy? In all three stories, the female characters are protected by their fathers until they find themselves in danger at the hands of another woman. This shows the relationship between women to be inherently competitive as they fight for the most valuable resource, a man. These children's stories reinforce the notion that a woman's ultimate goal is to find a man for protection and that other women can only stand in the way of this goal. Reading literature in this way reveals the underlying patriarchal ideology that limits women to dichotomous and mutually exclusive identities. One of these commonly referred to dichotomies is the Madonna and the whore, labels that categorize women as either the virginal mother of Christ or as sexually indiscriminate and promiscuous. In truth, these categorizations exemplify patriarchal male desire, the desire to own women of virtue who are worthy of being wives and mothers, and the desire to control women's sexuality so that it poses no threat to men's sexuality. As de Beauvoir writes, "No one is more arrogant toward women, more aggressive or more disdainful than a man anxious about his own virility." This categorization of women as good or bad carried over into ideas on the types of work that were considered appropriate for women. Consequently, many female writers in Victorian England published their works under male pseudonyms. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, were originally published as Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell, respectively. Mary Ann Evans published Middlemarch, among other works, under the name George Eliot. More recently, Phyllis Dorothy James published her detective novels under the name P.D. James. and most famously, Joanne Rowling adopted the name J.K. Rowling to publish the Harry Potter series. When Rowling's efforts shifted to crime fiction, she published under the entirely different but still male-sounding name of Robert Galbraith. Of the decision to use her initials on the Harry Potter books, Rowling states on her website that it was at her publisher's request, who thought a book by an obviously female author might not appeal to the target audience of young boys. While Rowling proved her publishers wrong, the belief in the universality of male viewpoints and men's stories remains pervasive. Feminist criticism is inevitably subjective, as we, as critics, cannot ignore our own experiences with gender, politics, race, religion, class, sexual orientation, and education when analyzing literature. The way to deal with such subjectivity is not to ignore it and proclaim our objectivity, but to be as aware of it as possible and include it in our interpretations so that others will be able to take our personal viewpoints into account when conducting their own analyses. This means that an African American reader may interpret a text differently than a white reader. A homosexual reader may interpret a text differently than a heterosexual reader. A working-class reader may interpret a text differently than an upper-class reader. Accounting for the differences these varying demographics lends to our interpretations of texts is known as intersectionality. Originally used to refer to the way sexism and racism overlaps, the term now applies to the way other forms of discrimination combine. This can include class, sexuality, able-bodiedness, and mental health. This term has risen in prominence as feminism in America has been criticized for largely belonging to white, middle-class, cisgender, heterosexual women and addressing their needs at the expense of women marginalized in multiple ways. In literature, we can explore intersectional feminist criticism when we compare the related books Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. A feminist reading of Jane Eyre might focus on Jane's plain appearance and lack of social standing. As an orphaned girl, Jane suffers abuse from her aunt and cousins until she is sent away to boarding school, after which she becomes a governess at Thornfield under the employ of Mr. Rochester. Although Jane is described as homely-looking and she does not come from money, she eventually wins the love of Mr. Rochester. However, flipping the fairy tale trope on its head, it is not Mr. Rochester who saves Jane, but Jane who saves him, quite literally from the manor after it has burned to the ground and left him blind. Jane is the savior of her own story, and she relies on her wit and firm sense of morals to earn her happy ending. Conversely, one might focus on the brooding Mr. Rochester in this criticism, which is exactly what Jean Rhys has done in Wide Sargasso Sea. A significant plot point in Jane Eyre revolves around the mysterious sounds Jane hears in the attic above her, and this is eventually revealed to be Bertha Mason, Rochester's first wife, who went insane and whom he has kept locked in his attic. Wide Sargasso Sea is a retelling of Jane Eyre from the viewpoint of Antoinette Causeway, the Jamaican heiress who finds herself unhappily married to an Englishman who renames her Bertha. The novel deals with themes of mental illness, colonialism, for Antoinette is the daughter of ex-slave owners, and female autonomy and agency. Here the Rochester figure, for he is not specifically named, is not the desirable romantic hero of Jane Eyre, but an abusive, controlling man who steals a woman away from her country and imprisons her in his home. The book attempts to unravel the mad woman in the attic trope that was born in Jane Eyre. Even though she created a strong female protagonist, we can see that Bronte is still working within the patriarchal constraints that reward women for behavior that has been deemed good and punish them for behavior that has been deemed bad. Let's compare two more novels that showcase the importance of intersectionality. Erica Jong's 1973 novel, Fear of Flying, was an influential second-wave feminist text. The novel was groundbreaking for portraying female sexuality in a manner comparable to male sexuality, suggesting that women did not need to be married nor entertain romantic connections in order to pursue satisfying sexual relationships. The book dispenses with the Madonna-whore dichotomy to offer an intelligent, self-aware female protagonist who is not waiting to be saved by marriage. In fact, the marriages that she does endure are either unfulfilling or abjectly violent. Her revelation is that nothing in her life will be satisfying unless she has the power to make her own choices. While this book was important in revolutionizing the idea of women's sexuality, its focus on a white, middle-class, cisgender, heterosexual woman is limiting. Another picture of femininity can be seen in Alice Walker's The Color Purple, which focuses on two female slaves who eventually engage in a sexual relationship. Not only is the issue of gender at the forefront here, so too are race, sexuality, authority, class, and colonialism. Together, Seeley and Shug are not just attempting to thwart the shackles of a limited notion of female sexuality as inherently romantic and existing for the purposes of male desire, but they must live under the bonds of slavery. They have been stripped of their freedom in every way. This work is notable because it does not attempt to categorize these women as lesbians, and therefore even more othered in their otherness, but as valid women with fluid sexualities. African American women have long been excluded from the discussion of feminism throughout history. Numerous speakers and writers have addressed this exclusion, most notably Sojourner Truth in her 1851 speech, Ain't I a Woman?, in which she asks, "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I could have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man, when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children, and seen them most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?" In many of her novels, Toni Morrison addresses the intersection of race and feminism. For example, The Bluest Eye focuses on Pecola Breedlove, a dark-skinned girl who dreams of having blue eyes and fair skin so that she will be loved. She believes that if she were beautiful, meaning white, then her mother would love her and she would not have to suffer her father's sexual abuse. Although Pecola is the darkest among her peers, all of the young girls in the novel feel the strain of their black skin and notice the difference in adults' behavior toward their blonde classmate Maureen Peale. It is whiteness that makes Maureen beautiful, and the girls know that they can never expect to receive the attention and sympathy reserved for those like her. Morrison writes, "Dolls we could destroy, but we could not destroy the honey voices of parents and aunts, the obedience in the eyes of our peers, the slippery light in the eyes of our teachers when they encountered the Maureen Peales of the world. What was the secret? What did we lack? Why was it important? And all the time we knew that Maureen Peale was not the enemy and not worthy of such intense hatred. The thing to fear was the thing that made her beautiful and not us." Other notable authors writing on the intersection of feminism, race, and sexuality include the poet Audre Lorde, activist Angela Davis, professor and commentator Roxane Gay, and scholar Bell Hooks. Note that Hooks spells her name without capitalization. It is important to remember that all types of literature may be approached from a feminist standpoint, not just literature written by women or for feminist purposes. Let's look at Daisy Miller, the protagonist of the 1879 Henry James story of the same name. In this story, Daisy suffers the ultimate punishment for seemingly inappropriate female behavior. Although she has previously met the polite potential male suitor Winterbourne during her travels in Europe, Daisy insists on keeping company with the caddish Italian Mr. Giovanelli, and her behavior is seen as scandalous. As a result of her spending a night outside with Mr. Giovanelli, and we can easily equate literally spending the night with a man with euphemistically spending the night with a man, Daisy falls ill and soon dies. We can infer that had Daisy chosen the worthier suitor, she would have lived. She is killed for following her sexual desires and rejecting the stable, presumably romantic marriage that Winterbourne could have offered her. Daisy is a bad girl. To offer a feminist critique of a more modern piece of literature, let's look at Lisbeth Salander, the heroine of Stieg Larsson's Millennium Trilogy. In the first book, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Salander is paired with journalist Mikhail Blomkvist to solve a murder. While it would be easy to view Lisbeth as a strong female character, she is highly intelligent and self-sufficient, she boxes, and she quite capably saves Mikhail's life at the book's climax, putting a spin on the damsel in distress male savior trope. We cannot ignore the manner in which Larsson describes Lisbeth throughout the novel. Frequent reference is made to her short stature and petite frame, and graphic detail is given to the horrendous acts of sexual violence of which she is a victim, all of which undermines her strength as much as possible. Additionally, her characterization as an autonomous, sexually fluid woman is at odds with her subsequent inability to separate a sexual affair from romantic feelings. The implication is that even this outwardly strong, independent character is inherently vulnerable and cannot be saved from the appeal of a fairy tale ending. Jeffrey Eugenides' 2002 Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Middlesex provides a unique opportunity for feminist criticism. Cal, the novel's protagonist, is intersex. Born biologically male with an androgen insensitivity that renders him resistant to male hormones, causing him to appear physically female, Cal is declared female at birth and raised accordingly. This discrepancy between sex and gender allows us to examine the ways in which gender is truly a social construct, as Cal never feels he is his true self when female and eventually makes a decision to live as a male. This book poses the questions of what female and male really are, and it forces the reader to examine the assumption that feminine and masculine are inborn traits. Questions of gender identity and sexuality have risen in prominence in recent years. Accordingly, novels exploring these subjects have been given significantly more attention and are being published more frequently for both adults and young adults. Novels such as If I Was Your Girl by Meredith Russo and George by Alex Gino feature transgender female protagonists and were written by a trans woman and a non-binary person, respectively. The protagonist of Juliet Takes a Breath by Gabby Rivera identifies as a Puerto Rican lesbian. And Seanan McGuire's Wayward Children series includes trans, queer, and asexual characters while focusing heavily on the dangers of forcing individuals to adhere to strict gender roles. Gender studies and queer theory are related forms of literary criticism. These were born out of the need to dispense with the binary categorizations of femininity and masculinity and give recognition to the idea that sex and sexuality are not inherently connected by nature. These theorists claim that gender and sexuality are concepts that one performs and that they are fluid. Like feminist criticism, gender studies and queer theory deal with ideas of equality and difference and reject the notion that gender and sexuality are innate. If you are interested in learning more about queer theory, please view our workshop on this subject. Thank you for watching this presentation on feminist literary criticism. For answers to questions about this or any other writing topic, stop by the Academic Center for Writing in W114.